In the underworld, Victor Moretti was known as the sculptor, not because he worked with clay, but because he could reshape a man's face with his bare hands. He was a man of cold logic and zero empathy. They called him the Iron Butcher, a man with no heart. But when he saw a widow weeping over a torn photo, he did something that would start a war. Victor thought he was helping a stranger. He didn't realize he was actually protecting the only person who knew his darkest secret. In the city of Oakhaven, Victor Moretti was a ghost story told to keep people in line. He was cold, calculated, and carried a scar on his cheek that everyone knew not to ask about. But one rainy Tuesday, the man who never blinked twice at tragedy stopped his car. He saw her, an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, clutching a framed photo of her daughter, torn right across the eyes with the number 22 scrawled over it. Victor didn't just give her money. He gave her his protection. But as Victor dug deeper into why the girl disappeared, he realized a terrifying truth. He wasn't helping a stranger. He was repaying a debt to a girl he thought he had killed 10 years ago. Before we continue our story, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe button. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain in Oakhaven didn't wash things clean. It just turned the city's sins into a gray, oily slick that clung to the bottom of your shoes. Victor Moretti sat in the back of a blacked-out sedan, his face illuminated only by the rhythmic orange glow of a street lamp passing every few seconds. He was a man of silence, a man whose presence felt like the heavy air before a lightning strike. On his left cheek, a jagged scar ran from his temple to the edge of his jaw, a permanent reminder that he had survived a world that tried to eat him alive. He was the Don of the Moretti family, a title built on a foundation of iron and blood. Yet tonight, his mind was elsewhere. He was tired of the noise, tired of the endless calculations of power. The car slowed as it turned onto a derelict stretch of the east side, a place where the law didn't go and even the shadows looked hungry. His driver, a young, nervous kid named Leo, cleared his throat. "Sir, there's a crowd up ahead. Looks like some of the local wolves are cornering an old lady. Should I go around?" Victor looked out the window. Under the flickering neon sign of a closed-down pharmacy, a woman was huddled against a brick wall. She looked fragile, like a piece of parchment that would crumble if the wind blew too hard. 3 men in hooded sweatshirts were circling her, laughing. One of them reached out and snatched a small, wooden object from her hands, a picture frame. The woman let out a cry that wasn't loud, but it was sharp, vibrating with a kind of grief that made Victor's chest tighten. It was the sound of someone losing the last thing they had left in the world. "Stop the car," Victor said. His voice was a low rasp, a sound like stones grinding together. "Sir," Leo stammered, his foot hovering over the brake. "It's just a street scuffle. We have the meeting with the Greeks in 10 minutes. Stop the car." The sedan lurched to a halt. Victor didn't wait for Leo to open the door. He stepped out into the downpour, the rain instantly soaking his charcoal gray wool coat. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to go. The thugs didn't notice him at first. They were too busy mocking the woman, tossing the picture frame between them like a football. "Please," the woman sobbed, her voice cracking. "Please, just a photo. Keep the purse. There's nothing in it anyway. Just give me my daughter." One of the thugs, a tall kid with a jagged piercing in his lip, held the frame up. "Your daughter? She looks a bit flat, Grandma. Maybe she needs some fresh air." He made a move to smash the glass against the brick wall. He never got the chance. Victor's hand clamped onto the kid's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. The sound of bone beginning to groan under the pressure was audible even over the rain. The kid let out a strangled yelp, his eyes bulging as he looked up into the cold, blue eyes of the man with the scar. He didn't know who Victor was, but he knew death when he saw it. "Drop it," Victor whispered. The frame slipped from the kid's numb fingers. Victor caught it with his free hand before it hit the pavement. He didn't look at it yet. He looked at the other 2 thugs who had frozen in place, their hands hovering near their waistbands. "You have 5 seconds to decide if you want to breathe tomorrow," Victor told them. They didn't need 5 seconds. They bolted into the darkness of an alleyway, leaving their friend behind. Victor released the kid's wrist, watched him fall to his knees, and then gave him a single, heavy kick to the ribs that sent him sprawling into the gutter. "Run," Victor said. The kid scrambled away, clutching his shattered arm. The street went quiet, save for the patter of rain and the heavy breathing of the woman. Victor turned to her. Up close, she looked even older. Her hair was a shock of white, plastered to her forehead by the rain. She was shivering violently. Victor looked down at the frame in his hand. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures radiating from the center, but the image was still visible. It was a black and white portrait of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old. She had a wide, hopeful smile and eyes that seemed to hold a secret. But someone had desecrated it. A thick, black line had been drawn across her eyes, tearing through the paper, and the number 22 was scrawled over her forehead in permanent marker. Victor felt a jolt of electricity go through his spine. He knew that handwriting. He knew the significance of that number. It was a marker used by the cleaners of the Moretti family, a code for a witness who had been processed and eliminated. "Her name is Elena," the woman whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "She's been gone so long. I just want to see her face." Victor handed the frame back to her, his fingers brushing against hers. They were ice cold. "You shouldn't be out here, Mrs. Gable." "Margaret Gable," she said, clutching the photo to her chest. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with cataracts but filled with a sudden, piercing clarity. "You have a kind heart, young man, even if you try to hide it behind that face." Victor almost laughed. A kind heart. He had ordered deaths while eating dinner. He had burned buildings with people inside. He was the devil of Oakhaven. But as he looked at Margaret Gable, standing in the rain over the ghost of a girl he realized he might have murdered, he felt a strange, hollow ache. "Get in the car, Margaret," Victor said. "I'm taking you home." "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." It wasn't a request. Victor gestured to the sedan. Leo was standing by the door, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape. He had never seen the Don act like this. He had seen Victor execute men for less than a late meeting. And here he was, playing the Good Samaritan for a woman from the slums. They drove in silence through the winding, cracked streets of the East Side. Margaret sat in the back with Victor, her small frame swallowed by the leather seats. She kept stroking the cracked glass of the photo, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Victor watched the city go by, his mind racing. 10 years ago, he had been a rising captain. There had been a hit, a high-ranking politician who had been talking to the feds. A girl had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Victor had given the order to his best cleaner, a man named Silas. "Clean it up," he had said. Silas had come back and told him it was done. But Silas was dead now, and the photo in Margaret's hands told a different story. The 22 wasn't just a record of death. It was a signature. And if the girl was in that photo, and the photo was in Margaret's hands, then the ghost of Victor's past wasn't buried as deep as he thought. They reached a dilapidated apartment building that looked like it was being held together by nothing but grit and hope. Victor got out and helped Margaret to her door. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. "Thank you, Mr. Victor," he said. "Just Victor. Thank you, Victor. Most people look right through someone like me. Like I'm already a ghost." She paused at her door, fumbling with her keys. "Would you like to come in? I don't have much, but I have tea. It's the least I can do for a hero." The word hero felt like a slur in Victor's ears. He should leave. He should go to the meeting with the Greeks and finalize the heroin shipment that would ruin 1,000 more lives. But he looked at the 22 on the photo one more time. "I like that, Margaret," Victor said. As he stepped into the small, cramped apartment, he didn't realize he was crossing a threshold he could never return from. In the shadows of the hallway, a man in a dark coat watched them enter. He pulled out a phone and dialed a number. "The boss just went inside with the widow," the man whispered. "He's compromised. Tell Marco. The plan is moving ahead of schedule." Victor closed the door, the sound of the lock clicking echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The war had begun, and for the first time in his life, Victor Moretti was fighting for the wrong side. The apartment was a cage made of memories. It was cramped, the air thick with the scent of dried lavender and the musty dampness of old wallpaper peeling at the corners. Every surface was covered in lace doilies and porcelain figurines that looked like they hadn't been moved since the Berlin Wall fell. Victor felt gargantuan in the space, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe as he stepped inside. He kept his charcoal coat on, the rain dripping from the hem onto the linoleum floor, a dark puddle forming around his expensive leather shoes. He felt like a predator in a dollhouse, an intruder whose very presence threatened to shatter the fragile peace of the room. Margaret didn't seem to notice. She moved with a sudden, nervous energy, fluttering toward a small kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a rusted sink. Sit, she urged, gesturing toward a floral-patterned armchair that looked like it had seen better decades. The tea will be ready in a moment. It's chamomile. Good for the nerves. You look like a man who carries a lot of nerves, Victor. Victor sat, the springs of the chair groaning under his weight. He didn't care about the tea. His eyes were locked on the photo Margaret had placed carefully on the coffee table. Up close, the damage was even more striking. The crack in the glass split the girl's face in two, but it was the ink that held his gaze. The 22 was written in a heavy, confident hand, the stroke of a man who didn't hesitate. It was the handwriting of Silas Vane, Victor's former right hand, a man who had been dead for 3 years. Your daughter, Victor said, his voice cutting through the whistling of the kettle. Tell me about her. Margaret stopped, her back to him. The steam rose around her head like a halo. Elena, she whispered. She was my everything. She was the first in our family to go to university. She wanted to be a journalist. She used to say that the truth was the only thing that could save a city like Oakhaven. I told her the truth usually just gets people hurt, but she was stubborn, just like her father. She brought over 2 mismatched ceramic mugs, handing one to Victor. He took it, the warmth of the tea seeping into his calloused palms. Margaret sat opposite him, clutching her own mug for warmth. She disappeared 10 years ago, Margaret continued, her eyes fixed on the photo. One night, she went to the library to finish a paper, and she never came back. The police, they said she probably ran away. They said girls like her get tired of being poor and find a different life. But I knew my Elena. She wouldn't leave me with a sink full of dirty dishes and a half-knit sweater on the chair. Victor took a slow sip of the tea. It tasted like grass and honey, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder that usually defined his world. What was the paper about, he asked. The one she was writing that night. Margaret looked up, a flicker of surprise in her clouded eyes. I don't know exactly. Something about the docks. She spent a lot of time down there, talking to the workers, taking notes in a little blue book. She said there was a shadow growing over the harbor, and she wanted to shine a light on it. Victor's grip tightened on the mug. 10 years ago, the Moretti family had been consolidating their power over the Oakhaven docks. It had been a bloody transition, a war fought in the dark against the old unions. If a young, idealistic girl had been poking around with a notebook, she wouldn't have just been a witness to a crime. She would have been a threat to the entire operation. And the photo? Victor asked, gesturing to the frame. When did it get like that? Margaret's face darkened, a shadow of fear crossing her features. It was in my mailbox 2 weeks ago. No envelope. Just a frame, the glass already broken, and that horrible number. Since then, I felt like I'm being watched. Men in dark cars sitting outside. Thugs like the ones you saw tonight, following me to the grocery store. I think someone wants me to forget her. But I can't. A mother doesn't forget. Victor looked away, his gaze drifting to a small bookshelf in the corner. Among the romance novels and prayer books, he saw a gap, a space where a little blue book might have once sat. Margaret, Victor said, his voice lower now, more dangerous. Why haven't you left? If people are following you, if you're scared, why stay here? She smiled, a sad, weary thing. Because if she comes back, this is where she'll look for me. I have to be here to open the door. The simplicity of her hope was a knife in Victor's gut. He knew the cleaners. He knew what 22 meant. In the internal ledgers of the Moretti family, 22 was the code for a body that was never to be found. Encased in concrete, dropped in the deep channel, or burned to ash in the industrial furnaces. To the world, Elena Gable didn't exist anymore. She was a ghost, and Victor was the one who had signed her death warrant. But as he looked at the widow, he realized something didn't add up. If Elena had been cleaned 10 years ago, why was the photo appearing now? Why was someone harassing an old woman over a cold case? His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. It vibrated again, and a third time. "You should answer that," Margaret said softly. "Important men always have important things to do." Victor pulled the phone out. It was a text from Marco, his underboss. "The Greeks are walking. Where are you? We have a problem on the east side. Call me now." Victor stood up. The room felt even smaller now, the walls closing in. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a thick roll of bills, bound by a rubber band. He set it on the table next to the broken photo. "Take this," Victor said. "Fix the window. Buy some food. Get a better lock for the door." Margaret looked at the money, her eyes widening. There was enough there to pay her rent for 3 years. "I can't take this, Victor. I didn't ask for charity." "It's not charity," Victor said, moving toward the door. "Think of it as a down payment. I'm going to find out what happened to your daughter." Margaret stood up, her voice trembling. "Why? Why would a man like you care about a girl like Elena?" Victor paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. He didn't turn around. He couldn't let her see the guilt written in the lines of his face. "Because I knew the people who took her," he said, "and I'm the only one who can make them pay." He stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. The air in the corridor felt colder, sharper. As he walked toward the exit, he saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. He knew he was being watched. He reached the street, where Leo was waiting by the car, looking frantic. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the fog was rolling in from the harbor, thick and white. "Sir, Marco has been calling every 30 seconds. He's at the warehouse. He says there's been a leak. Someone told the Greeks we were compromised." Victor got into the back seat, his face a mask of stone. "Drive, Leo." "To the warehouse, sir." "No," Victor said, staring at the blurred lights of the city. "Drive to the archives at the old Moretti estate. I need to look at the books from 10 years ago." "But sir, the Greeks." "The Greeks can wait," Victor snapped. "I have a debt to settle with a ghost." As the car sped away, Victor pulled the photo he had secretly taken of the 22 marker on his phone. He zoomed in on the handwriting. It was Silas's hand, no doubt about it. But Silas had always been a perfectionist. He never left witnesses, and he never left clues. If he had marked Elena Gable as 22 foot, why was her mother still alive? And why was the photo surfacing now, 3 years after Silas was buried? The realization hit him like a physical blow. Silas hadn't been a perfectionist. He had been a liar. And if Silas had lied about Elena, what else had he lied about? In the distance, the sirens of Oakhaven wailed, a mournful sound that echoed through the empty streets. Victor Moretti, the man who held the city in his palm, felt the first tremors of a landslide. He had started a fire to warm an old woman, and now he was going to watch his whole world burn. The Moretti estate sat on a jagged cliff overlooking the black churn of the Atlantic, a fortress of limestone and iron that had housed 3 generations of monsters. Victor led himself into the private study, a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and ancient paper. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he flicked on a single desk lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the mahogany walls. In the corner sat a heavy, fireproof safe. This wasn't where the money was kept. This was where the truth was buried. He dialed the combination with steady fingers, the tumblers clicking like a heartbeat. Inside were the red books, the handwritten ledgers of every contract, every hit, and every cleaning performed by the family over the last 20 years. Victor pulled out the volume marked with a faded gold 10. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the clinical descriptions of violence. Target, Morelli. Result, finalized. Method, long range. He kept flipping until he reached the summer months. There it was, June 22nd. The entry was short, written in Silas Vane's elegant, sloping script. Collateral, female, approximate 20. Witness to the Henderson liquidation. Status, processed. Code 22. Victor stared at the number. In Silas's world, processed meant the body was unrecoverable. But there was something wrong. Usually, Silas would note the location, Sector 4 for the docks, or the furnace for the crematorium. For Elena Gable, the location column was blank. There was only a small, faint symbol next to the code. A tiny, circled, Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze rattling the window panes. They stood for asylum. 10 years ago, the Moretti family had a silent partnership with the St. Jude's Institute, a private sanitarium for the mentally unstable children of the city's elite. It was a place where scandals were hidden and inconvenient people were sedated into silence. If Silas hadn't killed Elena, if he had instead stashed her in St. Jude's, it meant he had been keeping a private stash of leverage against Victor for a decade. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a video call from Marco. Victor answered, and the screen filled with the sweaty, panicked face of his underboss. Behind him, the interior of a shipping warehouse looked like a war zone. "Victor, where the hell are you?" Marco screamed over the sound of a distant siren. The Greeks didn't just walk. They opened fire. They said someone tipped them off that you were working with the feds. They think your little charity project with the widow is a cover for a meeting with a handler. My men are dying out here. "I'm not working with the feds, Marco," Victor said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And the widow isn't a project. She's a mirror. I'm looking at something I should have seen a long time ago. You're losing it." Marco spot. "The board is meeting tomorrow. They're talking about a vote of no confidence. You need to get down here and bleed for this family, or I swear to God, I won't be able to stop them from coming for you." "Let them come," Victor said, and ended the call. He didn't care about the Greeks or the board. He cared about the circle, He grabbed his coat and headed for the garage, bypassing the armored sedan for a discreet, midnight blue motorcycle. He needed speed, and he needed to be invisible. The St. Jude's Institute sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a high stone wall topped with rusted concertina wire. It looked more like a prison than a hospital. Victor pulled up to the gate, the engine of the bike cooling with a series of sharp pings. He didn't ring the bell. He knew a service entrance in the back that the family used to drop off donations. Inside, the air was sterile and heavy with the chemical scent of floor wax and industrial sedatives. He moved through the darkened corridors with the silence of a shadow. He reached the administration wing and forced the lock on the filing room. The air here was colder, smelling of dust and old ink. He searched for the 22 series. He found it in a drawer labeled Permanent Residence, Anonymous. He pulled out a thin manila folder. There was no name on the tab, only the number 22. Inside was a single admission photo taken 10 years ago. It was the girl from the frame, Elena, but she wasn't smiling anymore. Her hair was shorn short, and her eyes were vacant, staring into the camera lens with a hollowed-out terror. As he turned the page, a small, handwritten note fell out. It was dated only 2 weeks ago. Subject 22, showing increased cognitive recall. Requested mother. Recommandation. Immédiate relocation hors permanent silencing. Signed, Dr. Eris. Victor's blood turned to ice. This was why the photo had been sent to Margaret. It wasn't a gift, it was a threat. Someone at St. Jude's, or someone in the Moretti family, was cleaning up Silas's old loose ends. They were taunting Margaret to see if she knew anything, and they were preparing to finish what Silas had started a decade ago. Suddenly, the lights in the filing room flickered and died. The hum of the building's ventilation system cut out, leaving a silence so absolute it was deafening. "I knew you'd come here, Victor," a voice echoed from the doorway. Victor didn't turn around. He recognized the voice. It wasn't Marco. It was Father Dom, the family's consigliere, the man who had sat at Victor's father's right hand for 40 years. Silas was a sentimental fool, the old man said, stepping into the weak moonlight filtering through the high window. He was holding a silenced pistol, his movements graceful despite his age. He couldn't kill a girl who looked like his own daughter, so he made a deal with the doctor. "We kept her here, a ghost in a gilded cage, just in case we ever needed to remind you of the cost of failure." "You sent the photo to her mother," Victor said, his hand slowly drifting toward the knife hidden in his sleeve. We needed to know if the girl had told her anything before she was processed, and we needed to see if you still had the stomach for the hard choices. You didn't. You went to her. You gave her money. You showed your throat, Victor. Where is she? Victor asked. Where is Elena? Father Dom smiled, a thin, cruel line. She's being moved to a more permanent location. And as for the widow, well, we can't have her telling stories about a hero named Victor, can we? The rage that erupted in Victor was unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a businessman. It was a volcanic roar. In one fluid motion, he kicked the heavy metal filing cabinet toward the old man and lunged. A muffled thwip sounded as the pistol fired, the bullet grazing Victor's shoulder, but he didn't stop. He slammed into the consigliere, the two of them crashing through the glass partition of the office and onto the hard tile floor of the hallway. Victor pinned the old man down, his hand around his throat. Where is she? Dom gasped, a wet, rattling sound. Too late. Marco is already at the widow's. He's making it look like a robbery gone wrong. You're finished, Victor. Victor didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip until the light faded from the old man's eyes. He stood up, his shoulder burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't have time for the bike. He sprinted for the hospital's security garage, hot-wired a transport van, and tore through the front gates, the metal screeching as it gave way. He drove like a madman through the rain-slicked streets of Oakhaven. He wasn't the boss of the Moretti family anymore. He wasn't a billionaire or a legend. He was just a man trying to outrun a decade of lies. He reached Margaret Street just as a black SUV was pulling away. The front door to her building was kicked open, the wood splintered. No, Victor Guisperth. He leapt from a van before it had even stopped, sprinting up the stairs two at a time. The hallway smelled of gunpowder. He reached Margaret's door and threw it open. The apartment was trashed. The porcelain figurines were smashed, the lace doilies stained with mud. In the center of the room, Margaret lay on the floor, her white hair matted with red. She was still clutching the broken picture frame. Victor knelt beside her, his hands shaking. Margaret, look at me. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. She saw the scar. She saw the fear in his eyes. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she touched his cheek. You found her? She whispered. I know where she is, Victor lied, his voice breaking. I'm going to bring her home. I promise. Margaret smiled, a tiny, fragile thing, and then her hand fell limp. Victor sat there in the ruins of the apartment, the rain beginning to howl through the broken window. He looked at the photo of Elena. The 22 seemed to glow in the dim light, a brand of his own making. He stood up slowly. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline vacuum. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed the one number he hoped he'd never have to call. This is Moretti, he said. Activate the scorched earth protocol. Every warehouse, every club, every ship. Burn it all. And find me Marco. The Mafia boss was dead. The monster had arrived. The city of Oakhaven began to bleed orange. As Victor's command rippled through the encrypted lines of the underworld, the pillars of his empire started to crumble by design. Explosions rocked the industrial district as Moretti fuel depots went up in flames, and the harbor was lit by the pyres of luxury yachts. It was a tactical suicide, a scorched earth maneuver meant to paralyze his rivals by destroying the very prizes they were fighting to steal. But Victor didn't stay to watch the fire. He was a shadow moving through the rain, his charcoal coat now stained with Margaret's blood. He retreated to a cold site, a windowless basement beneath a defunct dry cleaner that only he and the late Silas Vane had known about. The air was stale, smelling of perchloroethylene and old gun oil. Victor sat at a rusted metal table, stripping and cleaning his Glock with mechanical precision. His movements were fluid, but his mind was a storm. He kept seeing Margaret's face, the way her hand had felt on his scar. She had called him a hero. The irony was a bitter poison in his throat. He pulled a laptop from a hidden floor safe and tapped into the St. Jude's Institute's internal server. Now that Father Dom was dead and the facility was in chaos, the digital firewalls were vulnerable. He searched for Subject 22, transfer logs. His eyes narrowed as the data scrolled by. Elena hadn't been moved to a permanent location yet. According to the GPS log of a medical transport van, she was currently being held at a private estate in the hills. Marco's personal villa. "You greedy fool," Victor whispered. Marco wasn't just killing the past. He was holding on to Elena as his final insurance policy. If the transition of power went sideways, he could use the dead witness to bargain with the feds or the other families. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. Victor didn't look up, his gun leveled at the entrance before the person could even step into the light. "Don't shoot, boss. It's just the kid who doesn't know when to quit." It was Leo, his driver. The young man looked haggard, his suit jacket torn, a dark bruise blooming across his forehead. He held his hands up, but his gaze was steady. "How did you find me?" Victor asked, not lowering the weapon. "You told me once that if the world ever ended, I should look for the smell of chemicals and the sound of silence," Leo said. "I figured this was the place. The family is in an uproar, Victor. Marco is telling everyone you've gone insane. He's putting a $10 million bounty on your head. Even your own personal guard is talking about collecting." Victor lowered the gun slightly. "And you? Why aren't you at the bank?" Leo stepped into the room, leaning against a stack of crates. "Because you saved that old woman tonight. I saw your face when you got out of the car. I've worked for you for 3 years, and that was the first time I saw a man instead of a monument. I'd rather die for a man than live for a monument." Victor looked at the kid. He saw the same dangerous idealism that had likely killed Elena's dreams. "Margaret is dead, Leo. I didn't save anyone." "Then save the girl," Leo countered. "The word is out. Marco has her at the villa. He's calling a meeting of the 5 families for dawn. He's going to present her as proof that you've been compromised by the past, execute her in front of them to show his strength, and take your seat." The cold, crystalline vacuum in Victor's chest began to pulse. He understood the play. Marco needed a spectacle to cement his legitimacy. An execution of a decade-old ghost would serve as a ritualistic end to the Moretti era. "I need a car that isn't in the system," Victor said, standing up. "And I need every flashbang and smoke canister we have in the stash." "I've got a stolen delivery truck outside," Leo said with a grim smirk. "And the back is loaded with enough hardware to start a small revolution." As they loaded the gear, Victor felt a strange, jarring shift in his reality. For 20 years, he had operated with a crew of hundreds, a web of informants, and the protection of the law in his pocket. Now, his entire mafia was a 20-year-old driver in a crate of stolen grenades. He was no longer the king. He was the insurgent. They drove toward the hills, bypassing the main highways where the police and Moretti patrols were thick. The silence in the truck was heavy. Victor stared at his reflection in the side mirror. The scar on his cheek seemed deeper in the moonlight. "Victor," Leo said softly, his eyes on the road. "If we get her out, what then? You've burned the business. The feds will be coming for you the second the smoke clears. There's no coming back from this." "I don't want to come back," Victor replied. He thought about the flash drive he had found in his archives, the 22 evidence. He had it tucked into his vest, right against his heart. It was his confession, his death warrant, and his only path to redemption. He realized he had been a prisoner just as much as Elena had been. He was a prisoner of his own greed, his own fear, and the shadow of the man he thought he had to be. They reached the perimeter of Marco's estate. It was a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion perched on a ridge, guarded by men with submachine guns and thermal optics. It was a fortress. "Park the truck half a mile down," Victor commanded. "When the first explosion goes off at the gatehouse, you drive like hell to the rear service entrance. If I'm not there in 15 minutes, you leave. You take the flash drive in the glove box to the district attorney. Don't stop for anyone." "Victor." "That's an order, Leo." Victor slipped out of the truck and disappeared into the brush. He moved with a predatory grace that belied his age. He wasn't the Iron Butcher tonight. He was a man with a single, burning purpose. He reached the gatehouse, pulled a small remote from his pocket, and pressed the button. A mile away, the Moretti warehouse on 4th Street, the one Marco used as his primary counting house, erupted in a ball of blue flame. The The guard at the gatehouse turned their heads, their radios erupting with panic chatter. In that split second of distraction, Victor was over the fence. He moved through the shadows of the manicured gardens, neutralizing two guards with silent, efficient strikes to the throat. He didn't use his gun yet. He didn't want to alert the house. He reached the back terrace. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, he could see the great hall. It was filled with men in expensive suits, the leaders of the Oakhaven underworld. And there, in the center of the room, sat a woman in a wheelchair. Her hair was long now, but it was graying at the temples. She was dressed in a simple white hospital gown, looking small and fragile amidst the wolves and silk ties. Marco stood over her, a glass of bourbon in one hand and a gold-plated pistol in the other. He was laughing, telling a story, playing the part of the new king. Victor felt a wave of nausea. She looked so much like Margaret. The same tilt of the head, the same defiant set of the jaw, even as her eyes darted around in terror. He checked his watch. 3 minutes until Leo's diversion. He reached for a smoke canister, but a cold circle of metal pressed against the back of his head. "I always said you were too quiet for your own good, Victor," a voice whispered. It was Rico, his own head of security, the man he had treated like a brother for 15 years. "How much, Rico?" Victor asked, his voice steady. 20 million, Rico replied. "And a seat at the new table." "Sorry, boss, but the world is moving on, and you're just a relic of a ghost story." Victor closed his eyes for a second. He thought of the torn photo. He thought of the number 22. He thought of the woman who had died holding a piece of paper because she believed in a monster's heart. "You're right, Rico," Victor said. "The world is moving on." In one explosive motion, Victor dropped to his knees, spinning as he drew a concealed blade from his boot. He drove the steel into Rico's thigh, and as the man screamed and pulled the trigger, Victor rolled. The bullet hissed past his ear, shattering a stone planter. The silence of the night was shattered. The alarm began to wail, a high-pitched scream that echoed across the hills. Victor didn't wait. He stood up, drew his Glock, and fired 2 rounds into Rico's chest. He didn't feel the victory. He only felt the clock ticking. He turned toward the great hall, smashed the glass with his shoulder, and stepped into the light. The room went silent. The most powerful men in the city stared at the man they thought was a ghost. Victor stood there, covered in rain and blood, his eyes locked onto Elena. "The meeting is over," Victor said, his voice echoing like thunder. "I'm here for the girl." The great hall of the villa was a cathedral of excess, filled with the heavy scent of Cuban tobacco and the sharp, ozone tang of fear. The 5 families sat frozen around a massive mahogany table, their bodyguards reaching for weapons that felt suddenly inadequate against the sheer aura of the man standing in the shattered glass of the terrace. Victor Moretti didn't look like a Don. He looked like an omen. His charcoal coat was shredded, his face streaked with the soot of his burning empire, and his eyes, those cold blue shards, were fixed solely on the woman in the wheelchair. "Victor," Marco said, his voice a mixture of a sneer and a tremor. He didn't lower his gold-plated pistol from Elena's temple. "You're late to your own funeral. I was just telling our associates how you've traded your crown for a widow's rosary." "The widow is dead, Marco," Victor said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the crystal chandelier above. "And you're the one who's going to pay the bill." Elena Gable sat perfectly still. Up close, the vacant look Victor had seen in her file was gone, replaced by a crystalline, terrifying clarity. She looked at Victor, not with the gratitude of a victim, but with the searing judgment of a ghost. She remembered him. She remembered the man who had stood in the shadows 10 years ago and nodded his head, sealing her fate. "Is this the hero?" Elena asked, her voice raspy from years of silence and sedatives. She looked at Marco, then back to Victor. "The man who gave the order, coming to save me from the man who followed it? You're both the same. You're just different shades of the same rot." The room remained deathly quiet. One of the heads of the Genovese family shifted in his seat. "Moretti, look at yourself. You've burned your docks. You've killed your consigliere. For what? For a girl who's been dead for a decade." "For the truth," Victor replied. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. He held it up so everyone could see. This contains every bank account, every offshore shell company, and every recorded bribe involving every man in this room. It's the 22 file. Silas didn't just hide the girl. He hid the evidence. And he gave me the key. A ripple of genuine panic went through the table. These men didn't care about a girl's life, but they cared deeply about their Swiss accounts and the federal indictments that would follow if that drive ever went public. "Give it to me, Victor," Marco hissed, his finger whitening on the trigger. "Give it to me, and I let her walk. You can go back to your gutter and die in peace." "You don't understand, Marco," Victor said, taking a step forward. The guards tensed, but no one fired. They were mesmerized by the sheer, suicidal confidence of the man. "I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here to clear the ledger." At that moment, a thunderous crash echoed from the rear of the house. The stolen delivery truck, driven by Leo, had just smashed through the service entrance, the sound of rending metal acting as a prearranged signal. "Now!" Victor yelled. He didn't fire at Marco. Instead, he threw a high-intensity magnesium flare into the center of the room. The hall exploded into a blinding, white-hot light. Men screamed, shielding their eyes, as the world turned into a featureless void. Victor moved by instinct and memory. He dived through the white light, his body a blur. He heard the gold-plated pistol fire, a sharp crack, but the bullet went wide, striking a marble bust of Caesar. Victor reached the wheelchair, his hands grabbing the handles. He spun Elena around just as a second shot whistled past his shoulder. "Hold on," Victor shouted over the chaos. He didn't try to fight his way out the front. He knew the exits were choked with guards. Instead, he tilted the wheelchair back and sprinted toward the far wall, where a massive tapestry of the Moretti coat of arms hung. Behind it was a reinforced steel door, a panic room he had designed himself during a previous visit to the villa. He slammed his shoulder into the door, dragging Elena inside, just as a hail of submachine gun fire shredded the tapestry behind them. He hit the lock, and the 6-inch steel bolts slid into place with a heavy, final thud. The room was small, lit by emergency red lights, and stocked with nothing but oxygen tanks and a monitor array. Outside, he could hear the muffled thuds of men throwing themselves against the door and the distant, rhythmic boom of Leo's distractions. Victor slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his shoulder. A deep graze was weeping blood through his shirt. "You're hurt," Elena said. She wasn't moved. She was watching him with a detached, clinical interest. "I've had worse," Victor grunted. He looked at the monitors. On the screen, he could see Marco screaming orders, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "We have 10 minutes before they bring in the thermal lances to cut through that door." Elena leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why? Why did you come for me? You could have stayed in your mansion. You could have let me stay a ghost." Victor looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look away from a victim. "Because your mother gave me something I haven't had in 30 years. She gave me a reason to hate what I see in the mirror." "She's dead, isn't she?" Elena asked. It wasn't a question of grief. It was a statement of fact. She had seen the world Victor lived in. She knew how it ended for the innocent. "She died believing you were coming home," Victor said softly. Elena's eyes finally softened, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "I was 20 years old. I had a notebook. I thought I could change Oakhaven. I thought if I wrote down the numbers and the names, the light would burn you all away." "The light is coming, Elena," Victor said, pulling the flash drive from his pocket and handing it to her. "But I won't be the one to hold it. You will." He walked to the corner of the room and pulled a hidden lever. A section of the floor slid back, revealing a narrow, vertical shaft with a ladder, an escape tunnel that led to the drainage system of the hills. "This leads to the ravine," Victor said. "Leo is waiting at the bottom in the truck. He'll take you to the city. Go to the federal building. Don't go to the police. Half of them are on Marco's payroll. Go to the feds and give them the drive." Elena looked at the shaft, then back at Victor. "What about you?" Victor checked his Glock. He had one magazine left. He looked at the monitors. Marco's men were already bringing the cutting torches to the door. The sparks were beginning to fly. "I'm a monster of the story, Elena," Victor said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "And a monster doesn't get to go home. He just makes sure the girl does." He helped her out of the chair and toward the ladder. She was weak, but the fire of her mother's spirit was in her eyes. She gripped the rungs, pausing for a second to look at the man with the scar. "My mother was right," she whispered. "You do have a heart. It's just buried under too much blood." She disappeared into the darkness of the shaft. Victor waited until he heard her reach the bottom. Then he slammed the floor panel shut and locked it from the top. He sat back down on the floor, facing the steel door. The heat was rising. The center of the door was beginning to glow a dull, angry red as the torches bit through the metal. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out his lighter. He didn't light a cigarette. He just watched the flame, steady and small in the red-lit room. He thought of the rainy street, the broken photo, and the number 22. The door began to groan. The first sliver of white-hot light broke through the steel. Victor stood up, leveled his gun at the opening, and waited for the world to end. The steel door didn't just open, it surrendered. As the last of the reinforced bolts melted into slag, the slab of metal was kicked inward, slamming onto the concrete floor with a sound like a tolling bell. A thick cloud of white smoke and metal vapor swirled into the panic room, illuminated by the rhythmic strobe of the villa's emergency alarms. Victor didn't wait for the air to clear. He fired 3 rounds into the haze, calculated chest-high shots. He heard 2 heavy thuds and a shriek of pain, but he knew the odds were a mathematical impossibility. "Enough!" Marco's voice boomed from the hallway, distorted by a gas mask. "Cease fire. I want him alive for this." The submachine gun fire stopped. Victor stood in the center of the red-lit room, his back to the sealed floor hatch, his gun empty and his chest heaving. He looked like a man carved out of granite and grief. 6 men stepped through the smoke, their weapons leveled at his head. Finally, Marco walked in, stepping over the bodies of his own soldiers without a second glance. He removed his mask, revealing a face twisted into a grotesque mask of triumph. "Where is she, Victor?" Marco asked, his eyes darting to the empty wheelchair. "Where did you hide the ghost?" Victor let his empty Glock clatter to the floor. He didn't answer. He simply stared at Marco with a look of profound, terrifying pity. It was the look a man gives a fly before it hits the spider's web. "You think you're a king," Victor said, his voice a low, dry rasp. "But you're just a man who brought the torches to his own funeral. Every second you spend in this room, the 22-foot file is getting further away. By dawn, your name will be the most hunted word in the country." Marco's face went pale for a fraction of a second before he surged forward, smashing the butt of his gold pistol into Victor's temple. Victor collapsed to his knees, blood blooming across his brow, but he didn't make sound. "Search the room," Marco screamed at his men. "Find a trapdoor. Find the girl." One of the guards moved toward the tapestry wall, kicking at the floorboards. "Sir, there's a seam here. It's locked from the other side." Marco turned back to Victor, grabbing him by the hair and forcing his head back. "The code, Victor. Give me the override, or I'll peel that scar right off your face." Victor smiled, his teeth stained red. "The code is 22, Marco. But it won't help you. The tunnel only opens one way, and she's already at the bottom. Kill him," Marco hissed, stepping back. "Kill him and get the saws. We're going down after her." The guards raised their weapons, their fingers tightening on the triggers. Victor closed his eyes, thinking of the rain on Margaret's window. He waited for the end, but the end didn't come. Instead, a series of muffled thumps vibrated through the floor, distant, heavy, and rhythmic. It wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was the sound of flashbangs detonating in the gardens. Suddenly, the monitors in the panic room flickered to life, showing the front gate of the villa. A fleet of black SUVs had smashed through the perimeter. Men in tactical gear, labeled with the bold yellow letters of the FBI, were swarming the lawn. They weren't moving with the caution of a standard raid. They were moving with the frantic speed of a rescue mission. "What is this?" Marco yelled, staring at the screen. "I pay the regional director. I pay the commissioner. Who authorized this?" I did, Victor whispered from the floor. I didn't send a file to the local cops, Marco. I sent a copy to a special task force in DC an hour ago. I told them exactly where the girl was and exactly who was holding the gun to her head. You didn't just capture a witness, Marco. You kidnapped a federal asset. The room erupted into chaos. The guards, realizing the scale of the betrayal, began to argue. Some wanted to fight. Others were already dropping their weapons, looking for an exit that didn't exist. Marco looked at the monitor, then at Victor, his eyes wide with the realization that he had been played from the very first moment Victor stepped into that rainy street. He raised his gold pistol, aiming it directly between Victor's eyes. Then you're coming to hell with me, Marco snarled. A deafening explosion rocked the villa. The ceiling of the panic room buckled as a breech charge detonated directly above them. Dust and debris rained down, and through the hole in the roof, 3 tactical shadows descended on fast ropes. Federal agents. Drop the weapon. Drop it now. Marco fired, but his aim was jolted by the shockwave. The bullet struck the wall inches from Victor's head. Before he could fire again, a hail of non-lethal rounds struck him in the chest and shoulders, sending him sprawling back into the empty wheelchair. Victor lay on the floor, the world spinning in shades of gray and red. He felt hands on his shoulders, felt the cold bite of steel zip ties on his wrists. He didn't fight. He let them pull him up, let them drag him out of the room and through the ruined Great Hall. As they let him out onto the terrace, he saw the sun beginning to peek over the Atlantic horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, the same color as the shadows under Margaret's eyes. In the distance, at the bottom of the hill, he saw the glint of a delivery truck's windshield. A woman was standing by the truck, draped in a yellow emergency blanket. She was looking up at the villa. Even from this distance, Victor knew it was Elena. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, a living, breathing testament to a debt that had finally been paid in full. Victor was pushed into the back of a black van. He sat on the bench, his head leaning against the cold metal wall. He was a criminal. He was a murderer. He was a man who would likely never see the sun as a free man again. But as the van pulled away, passing the spot where Elena stood, Victor felt a weight lift off his soul that had been there for 10 years. He looked out the small, barred window at the city of Oakhaven. The fires he had set were still smoldering, the smoke rising like incense over the harbor. The Moretti family was gone. The Iron Butcher was a memory. He closed his eyes, and, for the first time since he was a boy, he slept without dreaming of blood. The interior of the federal transport van was a tomb of sterile plastic and cold light. Victor sat with his chin tucked against his chest, the rhythmic vibration of the tires on the asphalt the only thing tethering him to the waking world. He was covered in the dust of the villa, a physical manifestation of his crumbled life. Across from him sat 2 agents, their faces unreadable, their fingers never straying far from their sidearms. They didn't see a man. They saw a database of crimes, a key to 1,000 locked doors in the city of Oakhaven. "You're a hard man to kill, Moretti," one of the agents said, his voice devoid of admiration. "Most people would have taken the money and the boat to the islands. Instead, you burned it all down for a girl who doesn't even want to say your name." Victor didn't look up. "The islands are for people who still have a future. I was just settling a bill." The van came to a halt, but they weren't at the federal building. The doors swung open to reveal a private airfield on the edge of the city. The wind whipped across the tarmac, carrying the salt spray of the ocean. Standing near a small, unmarked jet was a woman in a sharp Navy suit. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, the woman Victor had been feeding anonymous tips to for the last 6 hours. "Take the cuffs off," Jenkins commanded. The agents hesitated. "Ma'am, he's a high-flight risk and a multiple homicide." "I said take them off," she snapped. "He's the only reason we have the 22 file. He's the only reason Elena Gable is breathing. If he wanted to run, he'd be halfway to Cuba by now." The steel bit into Victor's wrist one last time before clicking open. He stepped out onto the tarmac, his legs stiff. He looked at the jet, then at Jenkins. "Where am I going?" "The hole." "Eventually," Jenkins said, walking toward him. She handed him a cup of black coffee that tasted like battery acid and salvation. "But first, There's someone who refused to get on her own transport until she spoke to you. She's in the hangar. Victor felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He would rather face a dozen of Marco's hitmen than look into Elena's eyes again. He walked toward the hangar, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Elena was sitting on a crate, still wrapped in a yellow blanket. The light from the rising sun spilled across her face, highlighting the lines that 10 years of trauma had etched into her skin. She didn't look like the girl in the photo anymore. The hope was gone, replaced by a terrifying, ironclad resilience. "They told me you turned yourself in," she said, her voice stronger now, no longer a ghost's whisper. "It was the only way to make sure the evidence stuck," Victor replied, stopping 10 feet away. "If I stayed out, the story would be about a gang war. If I'm in a cell, the story is about the truth." Elena stood up, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. She walked toward him until she was inches away, staring up at the scar on his cheek. "My mother told me stories about you. In her letters, the ones the hospital never sent, she said a man had started looking after her. She didn't know your name, but she called you her shadow son. She thought you were a guardian angel." Victor flinched. "I killed her daughter, Elena. Even if you're standing here, the girl you were is dead. I'm no one's angel." "I know," Elena said, "but you're the only one who didn't look away. Silas Vane kept me alive because he wanted a pawn. Marco kept me alive because he wanted power. You brought me out because you wanted to be able to sleep." She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel her palm through the torn fabric of his shirt. "The file I gave them, it doesn't just name the families," she said quietly. "It names you Victor. It details the Henderson hit. It details the orders you gave. You've given them the rope to hang you." "I know," Victor said. "Why?" Victor looked out at the horizon, where the city of Oakhaven was beginning to wake up, unaware that its masters had been decapitated overnight. "Because your mother asked me to find you, and I realized that as long as I was free, you would always be in hiding. The only way you get your life back is if mine is over." Elena looked at him for a long time. There was no forgiveness in her gaze. There couldn't be. But there was a profound, silent understanding. She leaned in and whispered into his ear, her breath cold against his skin. "Then die well, Victor Moretti. Don't let them turn you into a victim in court. Be the monster they're afraid of until the very end." She turned and walked toward the jet, never looking back. Victor watched her go, watched the stairs retract and the engines whine to life. As the plane taxied away, he felt a strange sense of completion. The debt wasn't just settled, the ledger was closed. Jenkins walked up beside him. "The transport to the high-security wing is here, Victor. You ready?" Victor turned his back on the sun and held out his hands, wrists together, waiting for the cold click of the steel. "I've been ready for 10 years, he said. As the car drove him toward the heart of the city, Victor looked at the passing buildings. He saw a young mother walking her child to school. He saw an old man opening a newsstand. He saw a city that didn't know it had been saved, and he knew he would never see it again. He was going to a place where there was no rain, no neon, and no memories. And for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt like a free man. The high-security wing of the Oakhaven Federal Penitentiary was not a prison. It was a vacuum. There were no bars here, only reinforced plexiglass and the hum of a ventilation system that recycled the same stale, filtered air until it tasted like copper. Victor Moretti sat on the edge of his cot, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the blank white wall. He had been here for 72 hours. In that time, he had spoken to no one. He had refused a lawyer. He had refused a phone call. He was a man waiting for the tide to come in. The silence was broken by the heavy thud of the magnetic lock. Special Agent Jenkins stepped into the cell, holding a thin manila folder. She looked exhausted. Her hair was messy, and there were dark circles under her eyes that mirrored the ones Victor had carried for years. She sat on the small plastic stool bolted to the floor and looked at him. "The city is in flames, Victor," she said. "And I don't mean the kind you set with gasoline. The 22-foot file hit the servers of every major news outlet 3 hours ago. Someone leaked it from the inside. Probably that driver of yours, Leo. The mayor resigned at noon. 4 judges have been taken into custody. The Moretti family is being liquidated by the feds, and the other four families are so busy stabbing each other in the throat to avoid the fallout that the police are actually winning for once. Victor didn't move. And Elena? She's in witness protection. Deep cover. She's gone, Victor. Even I don't know where she is now. But she left something for you. Jenkins opened the folder and pulled out a small, grainy photograph. It was a new print of the old photo, the one of Elena from 10 years ago. But the glass wasn't broken, and the .22 had been carefully bleached away, leaving only the ghost of the ink behind. On the back, in a sharp, journalistic script, were 3 words, "The truth saved." Victor took the photo. His fingers, which had broken bones and pulled triggers without a tremor, shook as he touched the paper. She shouldn't have sent this. It's a trail. It's a goodbye, Jenkins corrected. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. Marco is 2 cells down, Victor. He's talking. He's trying to cut a deal by pinning everything on you, including the murder of Margaret Gable. He says he has proof you killed the widow to keep her quiet about your involvement with the daughter. Victor felt a cold, familiar spark ignite in the pit of his stomach. Marco was always a better storyteller than a soldier. The problem is, people believe stories, Jenkins said, and the Bureau wants a win. They want to paint you as the villain who went mad and slaughtered his own. If you stay silent, Marco walks into a witness program and you walk into a needle. Is it the ending you wanted? Victor stood up and walked to the plexiglass, looking at his own reflection. The scar on his face was a jagged line through his history. He realized that his work wasn't done. Saving Elena was the act of a man, but destroying the system that created him was the act of a boss. I won't be a victim in his story, Victor said, his voice echoing with the authority that had once commanded an empire. Tell the district attorney I'm ready to talk. But I don't want a deal. I want a confession. A full, public record of every name, every cent, and every grave. And I want to do it in open court. No closed doors. No redacted names. Jenkins stared at him. You realize that's suicide? Not just legally. The moment you name those names on the record, there won't be a prison in this country that can keep you safe. They'll come for you in the shower, in the yard, in your sleep. They've been coming for me for 20 years, Victor said. At least this way, I'll know why. The next morning, the courthouse was a fortress. Snipers lined the roofs, and the air was thick with the tension of a city on the brink of a heart attack. Victor was led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuits, his hands and feet shackled. The gallery was packed with reporters, remains of the rival families, and the citizens of Oakhaven who had lived in his shadow for decades. In the second row, he saw Marco. The man looked frantic, his eyes darting around the room, his expensive suit replaced by a prison uniform that hung off his frame. Marco looked at Victor and tried to sneer, but the expression died on his face when he saw the look in Victor's eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was a final, devastating indifference. The judge pounded the gavel. Mr. Moretti, you have requested to waive your right to counsel and address the court regarding the charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and first-degree murder. Do you understand that anything you say can and will be used to secure a conviction? I do, Your Honor, Victor said, standing as straight as the chains would allow. Then you may proceed. Victor didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at Marco. My name is Victor Moretti, he began, his voice carrying to the very back of the room. And for 20 years, I have been the cancer of this city. I have built a world on the bones of people like Elena Gable and the grief of mothers like Margaret. I am guilty of every crime on that sheet, and hundreds more that aren't listed. A murmur ran through the crowd. Marco shifted in his seat, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. But I did not act alone, Victor continued. A monster only grows as large as the cage allows. Today I am opening the cage. For the next 4 hours, Victor Moretti dismantled the city of Oakhaven. He spoke with a terrifying, rhythmic precision, naming the councilmen who took envelopes in the back of Italian restaurants, the union leaders who looked the other way while the docks were bled dry, and the men like Marco who thought they could trade a girl's life for a throne. He detailed the .22 protocol. He explained how Silas Vane had betrayed the family, and how the cleaning of Elena Gable was the foundation of Marco's rise to power. He told the truth about Margaret's death, how she died with a smile because she believed her daughter was coming home, and how Marco had tried to steal that final, fragile piece of peace. By the time he finished, the courtroom was as silent as a graveyard. Marco was shaking his head in his hands. The prosecutors were staring at their notes, realizing they had just been handed the biggest case in the history of the Department of Justice. Victor looked at the judge. "I am ready for my sentence." He was led out of the courtroom through a side exit to avoid the mob. As he walked down the marble hallway, he saw a small television in an administrative office. It was showing a live feed from a park somewhere far away, a place with green trees and a clear blue sky. A woman was sitting on a bench, reading a newspaper. She looked up for a brief second, her eyes catching the camera. It was Elena. She was wearing a simple floral dress. She looked at peace. Victor felt a sharp, sudden pain in his side. He looked down. One of the bailiffs, a man he had known for years, a man whose mortgage he had paid once, was standing close to him. The man's hand was hidden by the sleeve of his jacket, but Victor saw the glint of the shiv. The bailiff's face was pale. "They have my family, Victor. I am sorry." Victor didn't cry out. He didn't fight. He simply looked at the man and nodded. "I know. Do it right." The blade went in deep, find the space between the ribs. Victor felt the warmth spreading through his chest, a strange, liquid heat that felt like the sun on the docks. He slumped against the wall, his breath coming in shallow hitches. The hallway erupted into chaos. Guards tackled the bailiff, shouting for a medic. Jenkins was suddenly there, kneeling beside him, her hands pressing against the wound. "Stay with me, Victor. Stay with me," she screamed. Victor looked up at the ceiling, the white lights blurring into a single, brilliant point. He didn't feel the pain. He felt light. He felt the weight of the last 10 years finally, truly leaving his body. He reached into his pocket and touched the photo of the girl without the ink. "She's safe," he whispered. "She's safe, Victor." "You did it," Jenkins sobbed. Victor closed his eyes. He heard the sound of rain, not the oily, gray rain of Oakhaven, but a soft, summer rain that smelled of lavender and clean linoleum. He saw Margaret standing in a doorway, her white hair glowing, her hand held out to him. "You're home, Victor," she seemed to say. The Mafia boss took one last breath, and the man with the scarf finally let go. The legacy of Victor Moretti didn't end with a funeral. There was no mahogany casket, no procession of black limousines, and no weeping-made men standing under umbrellas. The state took his body, and the city took his empire, but the truth he had unleashed in that courtroom acted like a wildfire that Oakhaven couldn't extinguish. Within a month of his death, the power vacuum he created was filled not by a new boss, but by the relentless machinery of federal justice. Marco and the heads of the remaining families were moved to a supermax facility, their names stripped of power and reduced to inmate numbers. 6 months later, the East Side docks, once the dark heart of the Moretti operation, were being demolished to make way for a public park. The rusted cranes and blood-stained warehouses were replaced by green grass and playground sets. On a quiet Tuesday, a woman walked through the new park. She wore a simple scarf and sunglasses, her movements fluid and unhurried. To anyone passing by, she was just another survivor of the city's turbulent past. Only the way she stopped at the edge of the water, looking out toward the Atlantic, hinted at a deeper story. Elena Gable sat on a bench dedicated to the memory of the lost souls of Oakhaven. In her hand, she held a small, weathered blue notebook. It was the same one she had carried 10 years ago, the one Victor had recovered from his archives and had Jenkins deliver to her in secret. It was filled with the idealistic scrawl of a 20-year-old girl who believed she could save the world. Now, she realized that she hadn't saved the world, but the world, or at least one man in it, had saved her. She opened the back cover of the notebook. Tucked inside was a small, handwritten note on a scrap of prison stationery. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was heavy and deliberate. "The debt is paid. Live a life worth the price." Elena looked up at the skyline. The Moretti sign that had once dominated the harbor was gone, replaced by the logo of a shipping company that paid its workers a fair wage. The city felt lighter, as if a great, suffocating shroud had been lifted. She thought of her mother, Margaret, and the way she used to talk about the shadow son, who brought her groceries and fixed her locks. She realized now that Victor hadn't been trying to buy his way into heaven. He had been trying to build a wall between Margaret and the hell he had created. A young man in a courier's uniform approached the bench. "Excuse me, are you Elena?" She stiffened, the old instincts of a ghost resurfacing. "Who's asking?" "I am," a voice said from behind her. She turned to see Leo. He looked older, his face clear of the bruises and the frantic fear of that night at the villa. He was dressed in a simple mechanic's shirt, smelling of grease and gasoline. He looked at her with a profound, shared understanding. "Victor left a trust," Leo said softly, sitting on the edge of the bench. "He set it up years ago, hidden under a dozen shells. It was meant for his retirement, but the final instructions were changed the night you were rescued. It's for the widows and orphans of Oakhaven. He wanted me to make sure you were the one to run it." Elena looked at the blue notebook in her lap. "He spent his life taking from this city. Why would he think I want to spend mine giving it back?" "Because he knew you were the only one who wouldn't let the money turn into a new cage," Leo replied. "He said you were the only one who knew the difference between a price and a value." Elena looked out at the water, where the sun was reflecting off the waves like shattered diamonds. She thought of the man with the scar, the monster who found a heart in a rainy gutter. She realized that Victor's final victory wasn't the destruction of the Mafia or the exposure of the corrupt politicians. It was the fact that she was standing here in the light, deciding her own future. "What do we call it?" Elena asked. Leo smiled, a small, sad expression. He didn't give it a name, but I think the 22 Foundation has a certain ring to it. A reminder of what happens when we stop looking at people as numbers. Elena nodded slowly. She stood up, tucked the blue notebook in her bag, and began to walk. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a ghost, or a witness, or a pawn. She was the daughter of a woman who believed in heroes, and the legacy of a man who proved that even the darkest soul can find its way home. As she walked out of the park and into the bustling streets of the new Oakhaven, the wind caught a stray piece of paper from a nearby trash can, swirling it up into the air. It was a faded flyer for a Moretti for mayor campaign from a decade ago. Now, just litter in a cleaner city. The world had moved on, just as Victor had said it would. The Mafia boss was gone, but the girl in the photo was finally, truly free. And in the quiet apartment on the east side, where a new family now lived, a single, small porcelain figurine remained on a shelf. A gift from a stranger that the previous tenant had left behind. It was a small, white bird, its wings spread wide, forever poised to fly. Victor spent his life taking from the world, but in the end, he gave everything to save a girl he was supposed to destroy. If you think Victor did the right thing by burning his empire for the widow's daughter, smash that like button. And if you want to see more stories where the villain becomes the ultimate protector, subscribe and hit the bell. Don't let the truth stay buried. Tell us in the comments. Was Victor a hero or just a man running from his sins? Watch this next story on the screen to see what happens when the past finally catches up. The end.